Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning. So we will start. There are about 25 people right now. We will start with an introduction. So Jinsu is ready with your presentation?
Yes, sir. Sir, I am using Lisa's team, sir,
Yeah.
because my team's got something issues.
Okay. Now, let me just give an introduction about the topic right now. We have moved our attention from the earlier concern with what is strategy and what is organizations. Now we have moved on to something new, that is resource-based view of strategy. And before Jinsu made the presentation, there was another presentation by Irene on competing on resources. These two are related. Actually, we went through the competing on resources presentation with some limited knowledge about what is resource-based view. And essentially, it is a major view about strategy itself in the whole strategy literature. That is, as I told you in that class, there is a there is an environmental view on strategy, and there is the resource-based view on strategy. And roughly, we can say environmental view focuses more on the opportunities and threats outside the organization, whereas the resource-based view looks at the strengths and weaknesses, mostly the strengths and capabilities of the organization, and integrates it with the external analysis of opportunities and threats also. So in that sense, this is a major topic. That is, the resource-based view is a major topic in strategy itself. And moreover, when you come to human resource management, we will see that the resource-based view of strategy places the human capital, that is human resources, in a better light as to the explanation as to how human resources contributes to the organizational level performance. So this is our motive in spending some time on the resource-based view. And remember, even before that, there was a presentation by Fatima on the intangible resources, right? That is again related to resources. The most important point being that intangible resources are not easily copied by the competitors, right? And Irene's paper was also elaborating on the same topic, that is how the resources can be utilized for competing. The title of the paper itself was Competing on Resources. So after Jinsu, there is topics such as revisiting dynamic capability by Jasim, and that is going to be again an expansion on the resource-based view, that is the capabilities of change, or the capability to change itself is a resource. And that's what is revisiting dynamic, or that is what is called dynamic capability, and that will be explained later by Jasim. And then Jesli will also be talking more about dynamic capability, that is understanding dynamic capability. So remember, why I'm saying this is that we are on the same topic with all these five presentations. Five, that is from Fatima's intangible resources onwards till Jesli. Jesli's understanding dynamic capability. Now, please keep your mind open to these suggestions, these things which are being said in the presentation, and try to connect what is being presented in all these five different papers. Try to find the interconnections between these five different topics. Basically, they are all revolving around the idea of resource-based view. And later, you will also see then we will start moving away from resource-based view to integrate human resource management also, meaning we will be starting to see how these discussions, these 5 or 6 discussions are going to enlighten us on why human resource management is important, and that's what we'll be looking at later on. So please keep this in mind and listen to, I think today Jinsu is going to present on resource-based view. Yeah, Jinsu, you can take
Yes,
over.
sir. Yes, sir. So is the slide visible, sir?
It's coming through. Yeah. It's visible.
So good morning everybody. I'll be telling about the firm resources and sustainable competitive advantage. This mainly shows how the firm resources and the sustainable competitive advantages link each other. And as an introduction section, this understanding the sources of sustained competitive advantage has been a major area in the research in a strategic management, and building on the assumptions that the strategic resources are heterogeneously distributed across the firms and these differences are stable over the time. And in which article that I got was that was mainly showing the link between the firm resource and sustainable competitive advantage. And in this, we will be mainly talking about main empirical indicators of a potential firm resources to generate sustainable competitive advantage, that are like value, rareness, amiability and substitutability. And in this it this is and this article will be concluding with the statement that the implications of firm resource models of sustained competitive advantage is for other business disciplines. And I said this. In this, there are two analyses. The first one is Porter 5-4 analysis, and next one is SWOT analysis. In the SWOT analysis, it says that about the opportunity, threats, weakness, all those things, and this shows how the firm sustain the competitive advantage by implementing the strategies. That is either by exploiting the threats, responding to the opportunities, neutralizing the threats, avoiding the weakness. And in this, it says that it suggests that the firms obtain a sustained competitive advantage by implementing the strategies that exploit the internal strength to responding to the environmental opportunities, while neutralizing the external threats and avoiding the internal weakness. Mostly we can get that the sustained competitive advantage has forced either on the isolating firms opportunities and threats. And in this, it says that the internal analysis, that is strengths and weakness, is the internal analysis, and external analysis is the opportunities and threats. And the strength and weakness is a resource based model, and opportunity and threats are the environmental model of the competitive advantage. And next one is Porter 5-4 model. And Porter 5-4 model helps this article, by the way, that is the attributes of an attractive industry, and that suggests the opportunity will be always greater and the threat is always lesser in these kinds of industries. And in this, there are basically two assumptions. That is, one is the firms within the industry may be heterogeneous with respect to the strategic resource that they control. And the resource may be perfectly mobile, therefore the heterogeneity can be long lasting. These are the main, basically two assumptions that is noted in there. And there are three concepts that is discussed. That is, one is firm resources, competitive advantage, and sustained competitive advantage. Telling about the firm resources can be any resources, that is all assets in this. That can be a capabilities, organizational performance, firm attributes, information, knowledge, all these things, that is knowledge, etc. That they controlled by the firm to used as a strength for improving the efficiency and for the effectiveness. And for this, there are basically three categories. First category is a physical capital, human capital, and organizational capital. And physical capital physical capital are like, for example, of physical capital are like technologies, infrastructure, location, and access to the materials, all those things. And human capital are like training, experience, relationship, and workers, manager skills, all these comes under human capital. And in organizational capital are like planning, reporting structure, controlling, informal relationship among the groups comes under organizational structure. And these also says that these resources can be act as a barriers or enabler of a firm's ability to implement the value strategy for sustaining competitive advantage. And Next one here is the second. Next one is competitive advantage and sustained competitive advantage. Telling about the competitive advantage is basically what discussed in competitive advantages. Firm is implementing a value creating strategy, not simultaneously being implemented by the other firms. That is, the firm is said to be a competitive advantage when it is implementing a value creating strategy, which is not simultaneously being implemented by the current or any potential competitors. The same sustained competitive advantage is the same, but it also has when these others are unable to duplicate the benefits of the strategy. And these are the two things. And in here they says that the resource must be heterogeneous and immobile. This means that the resource of a source sustained competitive advantage must focus on the firm's resources heterogeneity and in mobility. That is, if suppose an industry is populated with an identical firms, that has an access to similar resources, it is impossible for these firms to maintain a sustained competitive advantage because there may be many competition, all those things. And in order for the fast mover advantage, the firm in an industry must be heterogeneous in terms of the resources that they control, and entry barriers and mobility barriers, or these two barriers can be a source of a sustained competitive advantage when the resources are heterogeneous and immobile. And as I told in the introduction section, there are basically four main attributes of resources in this. That is valuable, rareness, inability, and substitutability. And in valuable resources, it says that the resource always should be valuable. That firm resources can be sourced as a competitive advantage when they are valuable, and they enable firm to implement strategies for increasing. These are basically for increasing the efficiency and effectiveness of the organization, and these strategies exploit opportunities and it neutralize the threats. And telling about the rare resources, if we are telling the organization and valuable resources is not a factor, but it should be also a rare resource. That if the resources are valuable, but it is easy to obtain and it cannot be used as a source of competitive advantage. But now we say is that they are valuable and the common resources can be used to ensure the firm survival. But if the number of firm possess a valuable resources is less than the number of firm needed to generate perfect competition industry, then it is a source. So it should be also a rare resources. And imitable resources means that the valuable and rareness resources can be difficult to imitate the order to consider as a source of sustained competitive advantage. That is, it says that because it has an imitable resources has a unique historical condition, and there is a link between the sustained competitive advantage and the source of casually, which is ambiguous. The resource generate firms advantages is socially complex. And the last one is substitutability. That is, last requirement of the firm resources is being sustained competitive advantage. There must be no strategically equivalent valuable resources that themselves either nor rare or imitable. That is, there should not be any substitute for these product. And next one is applying the framework. This is discussed here as this is applying the framework is like we say that the firm resource heterogeneity and there should be a firm resource immobility. These will lead to the value, rareness, imitability, and substitutability. This all four factors, that is these four attributes, lead to a sustainable competitive advantage. For explaining this, there's an examples on applying this framework in this given paper. That is three examples, that are strategic planning, informal process system, and positive reputations. This is linked with sustained competitive advantage. Now in detail we'll explain the strategic planning and sustained competitive advantage. For this, there is two things. That is, one is formal strategic planning and informal strategic planning. Informal strategic planning also we will be discuss with this four attributes. Discussing with the valuable and rareness. Informal strategic planning, invaluable, it enable to recognize the opportunities and threats, and it also recognize and exploit the firm's resources. And telling about the rareness, in rareness it is basically it is thoroughly, it is described and it is documented. And about the immutable and substitutable. In immutable, it is said as it is documentation and is done in a public sources, and other firms can lead to the same strategy. In substitutable, is like it is a strategic informal planning. And about the informal strategic planning, in informal strategic planning, the valuable are then to enable to recognize the opportunities and threats as same as a formal strategic planning. And but also this include the firm that recognize the importance of the process will likely to gain the strategic competitive advantage. And it is rare the firm try to prevent the process of from unfolding. And imitable, the process it should be tell us perfectly imitable when the process is being socially complex. And the next thing that is described here is and how these things are discussed, or how these are taken implications in this, that is in three areas. One is social welfare, organizational theory, behavior, and firm endorsement. And in case of social welfare, it says that when there's a high level of performance with the firm with resources are due to efficiency, it exploit the advantage. And also it is not to the effort of the firm to create imperfectly competitive conditions. This will lead to lead to fail in maximizing the social welfare activities. And in organizational theory behavior, this it proposes a framework such as that the research in an organizational theory and behavior can act as a rich source to find the resources that is with the four attribute, that is valuable, rare, not imitable, and not substitutable. And it can anticipate more immediate integration of the organization and economic as a way it study the sustained competitive advantage. In case of firm endorsement and linked with sustained competitive advantage is that the assumption of that managers are limited. Managers limited by the ability of manipulating all the attributes and characteristics of the firm. It also says that, however, it makes the firm resources imperfectly imitatable. These are the main three things that is discussed with this article, and that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, Jinsu, can you explain about the heterogeneity and mobility or immobility?
Sir, it says that in an this one in this article, the firm resources which we use, it should be heterogeneous. It should not be homogeneous, because it should be different from the competitors. So it should be heterogeneous and it should be stable. And that is like it should not the same thing should not be if it is homogeneous, there should be a unique thing, that all there won't be any special thing in this firm. So the organization which we choose, the firm resources always should be heterogeneous and it should be stable. Only then there will be a unique thing and it will be then only it will be differ from the other organizations.
Yeah, so if we are to use the simple terms, we will easily understand what is heterogeneity and immobility. It simply means that whatever a particular organization has is different from another organization. If it is the same resource that is available in both the organizations, there is no meaning of heterogeneity, or it becomes homogeneous. That is the meaning of it. So we want to use simpler terms to understand what is heterogeneity and immobility. So this is easily understandable, that a resource becomes something that can support the sustained competitive advantage if the resource is unique to that particular organization. And naturally, it follows if it is unique, it should also be. The other feature is that it should be immobile. There should be the quality of immobility. That means you have the unique ability, at the same time, it is not easily taken away by someone else, or in other words, immobile. So this is the basis on which the whole discussion on resource-based view starts. And then it speaks about the what are the resources, right? Physical capital, human capital, and organizational capital. So my question is, out of these three, which of them is more intangible, or rather more likely to be sources of sustained competitive advantage? There are three: capital, physical capital, human capital, and organizational capital. So, which of these is more likely to contribute to the resource-based view, in the sense that it is not easily transferred away or taken away by some other company or competitor? Can anyone explain that?
So would it be organizational capital?
Organizational capital is less easily taken away, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Then what about human capital?
Say if a competitive company or another organization is offering better
Uh,
uh, compensation or rewards to the employees there, they
uh,
can gradually move into the competitive organization.
yeah. So then again, if you look carefully at the human capital, you may be able to take away a few people, but more likely it is only few people than the whole set of people, isn't it? So there are other things also that is happening with human capital. It is not just the knowledge residing in one person, knowledge or skills residing in one person, but the whole thing as a whole, right? The human capital is not conceived in terms of one person's ability or knowledge or skills. It is in terms of the whole set of people having not just the knowledge, but also the ability to work together and interact with each other. And the knowledge is not good enough if it is residing with one person. It has to be shared across these different people, and then that is what makes the organizational learning or human capital, isn't it? So in that sense, even if the opposition or the competitor is able to take one or two people or a few of the people from the organization, the knowledge and skills would still remain within the organization among the other people, right? So it is almost as good as the organizational capital, that the human capital also qualifies as something that is not easily taken away by the competition, right? I hope that is clear, because we are not talking about some company taking away a few people from my company. Of course, that is not advisable, or that is not in the good interest of this organization, but still it is not possible to take away the whole knowledge, skills, attitudes and values of the organization in the general sense. So that way, the human capital also is one of those things that can be qualified as those resources, which is being discussed under the resource-based view. So what about the physical capital? Can it be a source of sustained competitive advantage? Say physical capital would mean the buildings, the plant, the machinery, the availability of material and things like that. So that is even more easily taken away, because except for some features of, like, say, locational advantage, or maybe the proximity to raw materials or and the market, except those things which are physical, most of the other things are like in terms of plant machinery and the technology, these are easily copied away by other people. So my point is that out of these three capital, the organizational capital and the human capital happens to be having those qualities which are which we can consider as advantages in the resource based view. Like That is the next part, that is valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitutable. So when it comes to that part of the discussion, we are now seeing the article is not necessarily speaking about what resources are, resources that can be considered as the ones under resource-based view, but rather it is talking about the qualities of those resources which are likely to be adding to sustained competitive advantage of the organization. So those qualities are summarized in VRIN. You can remember that easily. Valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitutable. So if these qualities are filled about a particular resource, then you can rest assured that this is not easily copied away by other competitors. Right, so this is the summary of the article. So remember, it is not inability, it is inimitability, meaning not able to be copied, not able to be imitated. That is the word. And then non-substitutable. It's not, yeah, it is not easily, there is no easy substitute for that particular resource or quality of that resource. So now we have a better view on what is resource-based view. First of all, it talks about the origin of this term, that is in terms of the strengths and weaknesses as in the SWOT analysis. It is focusing more on the internal part of the organization, especially the strengths, and not on the external part of the organization, which is characterized by what is called the opportunities and threats out there in the external environment. So RBV focuses more on the internal resources, internal capabilities, internal strengths of the organization. And that there is a reason why we shifted to resource-based view, because in the original environmental view as in Porter, the assumption is that the same forces are acting upon all the different organizations in the same industry. So if the same forces are acting upon all the different organizations in the same industry, you can say that all of them are facing more or less a similar forces, and all of them are responding in the same way, means that we cannot explain why some of them are better performing than the other ones. So that's why we looked into the organization, looked within the organization in order to see what makes some organizations better than the other one. Remember, we are talking about strategy. Our main concern is what makes some organizations perform better than the other ones, right? So here is the answer. We looked inside the organization and see that there are some things which are unique about the organization. And those uniquenesses is further explained in terms of valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitutable, which can be the sources of sustained competitive advantage. So that means now we have a better explanation of why some organizations are better faring than the other organizations. So that's where we are right now. Right, so now it is easy to see how this was related to Irene's presentation on competing on resources. It is basically an explanation, further explanation of how to compete using the resource-based view. That's why we did not discuss much about that in the last class, because we wanted to know what is resource-based view first and then describe what is competing on resources. Essentially, it is talking about the same things in much more detail about valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitutable. Maybe it also adds to the sources of, say, the value, or why something is inimitable. For example, it talks about path dependency, meaning the way one company has developed over a period of time, no other company can imitate, right? If Infosys has come in a certain way from the 1980s onwards, it's not able for any other company to go back to that time and then develop the same way. That's called the path dependency. You cannot go back in time. Then there is something called causal ambiguity. Remember, it is not casual ambiguity. Many people mistake it for casual ambiguity. It is not casual ambiguity. It is causal ambiguity, meaning the cause is not known. Why some things are, rare, and why this particular organization is able to do something is not easily understood. The cause of the success is not easily understood by the competitors. Then there is something called the social complexity. So these are the three sources of inimitability, for instance. So those kind of explanations are available in the competing on resources paper, which was presented by IRIN. All right. So now we move on to the next presentation. Who's there? I think Jasim is there.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
So can you see the slide?
Yes.
So can I start?
Yes.
So good morning all. My topic will be revisiting dynamic capability. So talking about the abstract, this paper brings out the ambivalence of literature on the conceptualization of dynamic capabilities by discussing the origin of dynamic capabilities and ambiguities surrounding its definition and attributes. So it makes an attempt to provide directions for working towards measurable constructs for dynamic capabilities. There have been different approaches to this particular study of the sources of competitive advantage, which includes competitive forces approach, strategic conflict approach, competence-based approach, and resource-based approach. So the focus of this paper is on dynamic capabilities approach, which is an extension of the resource-based approach. This approach stems from the innovation-based competition, which was proposed by Schumpeter to explain the success and failure of the firms, and also advocates the idea of creative destruction of competencies. So moving on to resource-based view of strategy, it
Jasim,
emphasizes that the
the slides are not moving. Yeah, now it is moving. Can you put it in slideshow mode?
Sure. So is it visible now?
Yes, go ahead.
So the resource-based view emphasizes on the competitive advantage which lies between the ownership of scarce and valuable resources. And in the article, Barney mentioned that firms that achieve sustainable competitive advantage when resources are valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitute, which includes VRIN attributes. So the attributes resources are identified by observing superior performance and then attributing that performance to the unique resources that the firm appears to possess. When these resources have complementaries, it enhances their potential to create sustained competitive advantage. So the origin of dynamic capabilities, the resource-based view of strategy, which gives a static view of the resource portfolio of the firm. It does not adequately explain the reasons for competitive advantage during rapid and unpredictable change. In the high velocity markets, the strategic challenge for managers is to maintain a complete sustainable competitive advantage. So the attributes of dynamic capability are specified. The properties of dynamic capabilities have been debated at length by the researchers, which have been mentioned in the article. The following aspects of dynamic capabilities have received much attention. First, dynamic capabilities are specific identifiable processes. Dynamic capabilities exhibiting commonalities. Dynamic capabilities being equifinal, fungible, and substitutable processes. Dynamic capabilities being idiosyncratic to a certain extent. So it has been suggested that dynamic capabilities exhibit commonalities across firms and are equifinal, that is, approached on different paths. However, such commonalities have not been systematically identified by the firms. So different firms have developed effective dynamic capabilities which could be common to a certain extent, but equifinal and with different starting points, depending upon the organization. So talking about market velocity and dynamic capability, there have been attempts to demystify dynamic capabilities by identifying its mechanisms, component factors, and preprocessors. TC et al., which is an organization, identified learning, reconfiguration, and coordination or integration as the key process in dynamic capabilities. A researcher sought conceptualized dynamic capabilities as routines for evolutionary learning. He also identified three mechanisms followed by firms to attain dynamic capability, which are variation, selection, and retention, which were practiced through experimentation and imitation. Other researchers proposed 5 core processes within dynamic capabilities, and they include reconfiguration, sensing, learning, coordinating, integrating, and suggested reconfiguration as a latent second order construct consisting of other 4 core processes. The difference arises when dynamic capabilities are viewed through varying lenses such as resource-centric lens, organizational lens, and capability-centric lens. So these conceptualizations have added different dimensions to the notion of dynamic capabilities. Conceptualization, the core process in dynamic capabilities. So in this paper, it is an attempt to conceptualize the core process of dynamic capabilities from the above literature. So the intention is to identify the core process of dynamic capabilities and delineate their interrelationships. A second order formative model for dynamic capabilities have been proposed, which constitutes 3 first order processes, namely learning, reconfiguration, and coordination and integration. So in learning process of generating new knowledge and building new thinking to enhance existing resources. Learning as a capability is the ability to acquire, assimilate, transform, and exploit existing knowledge to generate new knowledge. So some examples of learning process are knowledge brokering, knowledge articulation, and codification, new thinking, pursuing new innovative solutions, and initiatives. The reconfiguration process changes the existing configuration of resources into new ones that match the changing environment. Reconfigurability as a capability has been connected to the appropriateness, timeliness, and efficiency by which existing resources are reconfigured into new operational competencies. In this article, has proposed a more specific definition of reconfiguration as a process which consists of any change in the pattern or degree of interaction between resources, which will be existing and new. So this notion of reconfiguration is different from the notion of operational routines, which has been proposed by the authors. So routines are identified as learned, patterned, and repetitious behavior. So talking about coordination and integration, which is a dynamic capabilities which have been viewed as the process that help the development of reconfigured resources. They have been clubbed together since their roles are complementary within dynamic capabilities. So the capability to coordinate has been distinguished theoretically and empirically from the capability to integrate, while integration specifies the organizing principles by which individual input is integrated and coordinated. So the coordination has been extensively discussed by Crosstone, who describes it as the ability to manage dependencies and resources, and also task dependency, task resource dependency, and resource dependency. The primary activities involved in coordination are task assignment, resource sharing, and managing dependencies. So in this paper, learning, reconfiguration, coordination, and integration have been proposed as a concurrent process constituting dynamic capabilities. The role of each of these core process in shaping dynamic capabilities is highly context specific and dependent on the needs of the firm. Although the thrust on each of these processes is not identical. These are certain considerations that require attention as researchers who attempt to decompose dynamic capabilities. Future research could be directed towards developing and validating multidimensional concepts of dynamic capabilities. Given our limited ability to explain the source of sustainable competitive advantage in dynamic markets, there is a need for dynamic capabilities to get a greater share of scholarly attention. That's all.
So can I have the first slide once again, starting from the slideshow? Yeah. So now the most important aspect about dynamic capability is that it's trying to explain resource-based view and considering the fact that it is not a static world but a fast changing world. So that's the meaning of the dynamic. The word dynamic itself means that things are not static but they are moving. So this is an attempt to explain the resource-based view itself in more suitable terms for a changing environment. Next slide, please.
Sir, is it visible?
Yeah. So this is basically a summary of what we discussed earlier in terms of resource-based view. Uh, Everything is over there, like assets, capabilities, processes, attributes, information, knowledge. All these are the different resources that the organization has, which has the potential to be called, valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitutable. And these are, as we saw in the previous presentation, heterogeneously distributed and stable over time, meaning that it's not mobile, easily mobile, easily taken away by other companies. Next, please. Yeah, so the context is now different because now the context is more in terms of a changing environment. So when we discuss something as resource, we assume that things are going to be stable over a period of time. But the same resources act differently when there is a context which is changing. That is the feature of the present world. Maybe up to about 1970s, there was very little of change. Only the discussion on change happened after that. 1980s onwards, we have what is called the discussion on change and the need for management of change and things like that. And it is in that context now that we have to understand the resource-based view. That's the point about this article. It is assuming a rapidly changing environment, the political, social, economic, and all the other factors such as legal, environmental, all those things are changing, and that's where the dynamic capability is. So, what is a capability and what is a dynamic capability? Here it implies that the ability to change is itself a resource. That is the main point about this paper, that in the previous paper when we talked about physical capital, human capital and organizational capital, we did not pay much attention to the ability to change because that's a different capability altogether. So change happens all the time, and adapting to that change or even moving along with the change is now what is called the dynamic capability, and that itself is another resource. Please remember that. That is the addition to resource-based view here. The dynamic capability is something that in addition to all the things that we discussed about resource-based view, we need to now consider the ability to change itself as another resource. Next slide, please. Yeah. There are a few terms to be described over here. For example, specific identifiable processes that we can understand. Exhibiting commonalities also we can understand. Now, dynamic capabilities being equifinal, fungible, and substitutable processes. This is something that we need to discuss. One is the equifinal. The equifinal means there are different ways to reach the same destination. That is from the systems theory. We understand that it is not just one path that leads to the desired destination, but there are many different ways to reach the desired destination. That is the meaning of equifinality. Then there is fungibility. Fungibility means that something that can be identified and uh, used across in different scales and even different places also. This is something like substitutability. When you have a substitutable resource, you replace one resource with another one. But fungibility is that it can easily be adapted to different conditions and scales of activities. That is the meaning of fungibility. And that becomes another resource. So those companies which are capable of reaching the destination through another way, that is the idea of equifinality. One company may be achieving performance through a certain set of combination of processes, but another company may be looking forward to reaching the same destination using another set of processes. This is the meaning of equifinality. And that means that depending on the circumstance, you may have to put together different resources, put together different resources in such a way that we reach the same destination. And that is another feature of the dynamic capability. So that means that quick identification of what is the change and quick putting together of the resources. That is the meaning of reconfiguration. The same resources that we have today can be reconfigured, rearranged to get the results in a different manner. In a different combination, we can reach the same destination. This is the meaning of equifinality, and that is another dynamic capability. Then idiosyncratic, meaning that it is very unique. Very unique to a particular organization is the meaning of idiosyncratic. Maybe that means that it cannot be easily taken away by the other competing organizations. So now, just like we spoke about VRIN for the resource-based view, now we could say that there is something called identifiable processes, then commonalities, then equifinality, and the idiosyncrasy. So PCEI, that is identifiable processes, then commonalities, then equifinality, and what is called idiosyncrasy. So this could be what summarizes what is dynamic capability. Okay, just like we remembered our VV from VRIN, now we can form another acronym PCEI, P for processes identifiable, then commonalities, equifinality, and idiosyncrasy. So this is how we remember the dynamic capability. Next slide, please. Yeah, market velocity, obviously, the market is something outside the organization, but we cannot ignore that. And how fast the market is changing is what determines how dynamic we have to be, right? That's the meaning of this. So how fast the market is changing, first of all, we need to sense that and identify that the market is changing, not just market, but also the other forces, other contextual forces like political, economic, social, legal, and environmental. At the same time, we should be also able to, what is the response to that? What is the response to that change? And one of the things that has been explained in dynamic capability is I think the most important one is the reconfiguring. It's not about changing the resources, but using a different combination of the same resources. That is the focus of dynamic capability. Next slide, please. Yeah. Okay. That's why now what are the things that are required? Learning the reconfiguration, then coordination and integration. Is that the three ones? Learning, reconfiguration, and coordination integration. Just imagine otherwise, even forget the complexity of these terms. What is required in a changing environment? First of all, learning. Learning means that you must first sense there is change that is happening, and also in what direction the change is happening. So our internal response will be in terms of rearranging our own resources or reconfiguring our own resources, and in a way that will be most appropriate for the change that is happening elsewhere outside. And then you have the coordination and integration, meaning that how do we put together again. So whenever there is a reconfiguration, it means that now there is more of managerial requirement to coordinate and integrate the new combination, isn't it? So this is how the dynamic capability is conceived of. So remember, it is an extension of the resource-based view. Now we are talking not just about resources in the static sense, but also the ability of the organization to change in line with the requirements of the whatever the changes that are happening outside. So we have one more addition to the resource-based view now, one in the dynamic capability discussion, and this gives us a better view. Now, the question is whether this all, focuses our attention on the human resource management, right? These changes or these terms of RBV and dynamic capability now will have to slowly move on to explaining how does human resource management contribute to sustained competitive advantage. That is why we are discussing these things in advance. We need to understand, resource-based view and dynamic capability in order to now link it to what is it that about human resource management that can contribute to sustained competitive advantage. In other words, many of these resources that we are talking about, resource-based view, are going to be much closer to what is called the human resource capabilities. Right? This is the direction in which our discussion is going now, right now. Next slide, please. Yeah. So, so this is again, there is more to do on that. But remember, for the time being, there is something called the resource-based view. There is something called dynamic capability, which is a special kind of resource, which is the ability to change, ability to adapt to the market requirements. And how this is happening is through the learning, reconfiguring, and coordination and integration. And specifically, we will see later on that this is much more closer to our discussion on human resource management and its capabilities. And that way, we would see that how does the next question that we are going to answer is how does HR contribute to organizational level performance? Remember, in the initial discussions, we said that it is very difficult to demonstrate how does human resource management contribute to organizational level performance. So we are now close to that feat, especially because now we have the theoretical background of what is called resource-based view and the dynamic capability view and the details regarding that. And we will see that in the next presentation from Chandrakant later. Chandrakant, I hope you are prepared on HRM and RBV. In the meanwhile, Jasli, can you present on understanding dynamic capability? Jasli, are you there?
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
Hello.
you can go ahead now.
Hello. Set slide visible.
Yes.
Good morning. My topic is understanding dynamic capabilities. What is dynamic capability? The capabilities of an organization that purposefully adapt an organization's resource base. That means that the firm's ability to integrate, build, and reconfigure internal and external competencies to address rapidly the changing environment. Introduction. Many strategic scholars not easily convinced about the values of the concept of dynamic capability. While some see dynamic capabilities as a key to competitive advantage, others seems to doubt that there are actually such things. Still, others believe that they exist but suspect that they are not made. That is, they are born. They doubt deliberately the effort to strengthen such capabilities are genuine options for the managers. And some believe that while they are genuine options, they are not necessarily something that configure competitive advantage. From this article, they try to seek to reduce the mysteries surrounding both the terminologies and phenomena. It identifies some key issues and argues that clarity is served by keeping these issues distinct. It offers a proposal that seems constructive, but of course will really prove to be so only if it is widely adopted. Moving on to routine and capabilities. The concept of organizational capabilities or the broader concept of organizational routine. Organizational capabilities means that is a higher level routine that together with its implementing input flow and configure upon an organization's management a set of decision options for producing significant output of a particular type. For a present purpose, the point deserving emphasis here is that connotations of routine, behavior that is learned, highly patent and repetitive and quasi-repetitive, found in a particular part in a statist knowledge and specificity of the object. A brilliant improvisation is not a routine. There is no such thing as a general purpose routine. Dynamic connotes changes. In 1994, Collis is in a particular explicit and formally in making a point that dynamic capabilities governs the rate of change of ordinary capabilities. Following the example of a differential calculus, he points that the existence of second order, third order, etc., the dynamic capabilities and the explicitly makes the extension to ad infinitum. This terminological approach is adopted here, but with an important caveat as to whether higher order capabilities exist in an interesting sense. From a logical point of view, the existence of a higher order rate of a change is a question only in a mathematical sense that derives might not exist. And from a conceptual point of view, computational point of view, the time sequence of n plus 1 values of variable suffix to compute one value of nth order rate of change. If a dynamic capabilities are similar to capabilities in that they involve patterned activities oriented to relatively specific objectives, then there is no guarantee that the organizational process governs higher order change are highly patterned. From a substantive sense, the higher order dynamic capabilities does not necessarily exist. The zero level in the capability hierarchy. It confers to the common sense and the existing practice, at least for our capabilities of a firm competing in the market. An organization that keeps earning its living by producing and selling the same product on the same scale and to same customer population over time. The capabilities exercised in that stationary process are the zero level capabilities. The capabilities that would change the product and the production process, the scale or the customer are not considered as a zero level capability. New product development as practiced in many firms are known as prototypical firms. For a firm that does its own R&D and producing and selling the product in a zero order activity, for an independent R&D lab, developing new products is a zero order activity. Means that a organization that sells its own produces and sells the same product for a regular customer itself is known as zero level capabilities. Ad hoc problem solving. It is typically appears as a response to a novel change from the environment or other relative unpredictable event. Ad hoc problem solving is not a routine in a particular, not highly patterned or not repetitive. Ad hoc problem solving and the exercise of a dynamic capabilities are two different ways of change or two categories comprising numerous different ways to change. The response to dynamic capabilities typically involves longer-term commitments to specialized resources. The more persuasive and detailed the patterning of activities involves, the higher the cost of the commitment tends to be. The ability to sustain a particular pattern approach to new product development, for example, depending to some extent of community in the engineering personnel involves, they may substantiate community facilities and equipment as well. By a contrast, the cost of ad hoc problem solving largely disappears if there is no problem to be solved. Many of those costs takes the form of opportunity cost of personnel who have alternate productive roles in the capability. Higher order capabilities. Higher order capabilities means that a deliberate investment in the organizational learning, for example, a facility that the creation and the modification of dynamic capabilities for the management of acquisition and alliances. In 1994, Collis argues that the existence of higher order capabilities provide a robust